Hello, everybody. Happy Sunday. I'm going to be stress-free today because the Steelers already lost on Thursday to Cleveland. So we're just going to move right along to one of everybody's favorite series. Certainly one of mine and hopefully one of yours. History by Mail has returned. We've got our holiday shopping list. I'm going to see, what was the one? I think it was the Transfer of Power. I believe. I forgot to look before I came over here. I think it was the Transfer of Power series. And last week was the accession of Queen Victoria. What do we have here? House of Representatives, Washington, D.C. And this is that's not embossed, but this is a very, very nice silky paper. October 11th, 1973. Oh, geez. From Gerald Ford, Minority Leader. Dear Mr. President, on the basis of the criteria outlined by you at the meeting in your office, I am recommending the following in order of my preference. 1. John Connally. 2. Mel Laird. 3. Nelson Rockefeller or Ronald Reagan. I will not go into the reasons for my views, as I'm sure you are familiar with reasons in each instance. Excuse me. You can rest assured that I will fully cooperate and assist in this and all other problems in the months ahead. Warmest personal regards. Sincerely, Gerald R. Ford, the President of the White House. All right. So, I mean, we know the time frame, we know the players, but what is involved, I should say. Here we go. Letter from Gerald Ford to President Richard Nixon regarding candidates for Vice President, October 11th, 1973. Interesting. In 1973, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned after being accused of tax evasion and accepting bribes, becoming the first U.S. Vice President, to resign due to criminal charges. The 25th Amendment, which had been ratified just 6 years earlier, spells out in Section 2 that the President, Richard Nixon at the time, can nominate a person to fill a vice presidential vacancy. The President's nominee must then be confirmed by a majority vote of both houses of Congress. President Richard Nixon asked for input on the selection of a vice presidential nominee from several advisors. Nixon had 3 criteria. The nominee must, 1, be capable of serving as president, which would come in handy soon after. 2, share Nixon's foreign policy views. 3, be able to work with both parties in Congress and be capable of confirmation by both the House and the Senate. Nixon sought the advice of House Minority Leader Gerald Ford, among many other advisors, who sent his recommendations in the enclosed letter. Suggestions for Vice President. Gerald Ford's suggestions for Vice President. We saw those in the letter, but now we're going to get the reasons. John Connally, former Texas governor and former Treasury Secretary under Nixon. Connally had stepped down from the Treasury Secretary after 16 months to lead the Democrats for Nixon organization that campaigned for Nixon's re-election in 1972. A little bit of a typo there. Though a Democrat until 1973, Connally was convinced that as many as 20 million Democrats would vote for Republican candidate Richard Nixon over Democratic candidate George McGovern due to fears over defense spending cuts, among other issues. 2. Mel Laird, former Wisconsin congressman and then Secretary of Defense under Nixon. Laird was a key player in Nixon's cabinet, especially regarding Vietnamization, the process of transferring more responsibility for combat to the South Vietnamese forces. Laird did not always agree with Nixon on the timetable for withdrawal from Vietnam. 3. Nelson Rockefeller, governor of New York, who had unsuccessfully sought the Republican presidential nomination in 1960, 1964, and 1968. Rockefeller was considered a moderate Republican, and the term Rockefeller Republican came to mean those in the Republican Party who held moderate to liberal domestic social views. Gerald Ford would eventually choose Rockefeller to become his vice president, the second vice president to be appointed under the new 25th Amendment, the first being Ford himself. And Ronald Reagan, former Hollywood actor and president of the Screen Actors Guild. Reagan was then governor of California. Reagan would go on to serve 2 terms as U.S. president from January 20th, 1981 to January 20th, 1989. Nixon received hundreds of letters from members of Congress suggesting nominees. Common suggestions included Secretary of State William P. Rogers, Chairman of the Republican National Committee George H.W. Bush, and Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. Massachusetts Senator Margaret Heckler suggested Nixon nominate a woman, explaining, no woman in high public office has ever been tainted with a hint of scandal, and nomination of a woman as vice president would go far toward helping restore public confidence in our government. Michigan Congressman and House Minority Leader Gerald R. Ford, however, was the overwhelming favorite among suggestions from Congress. Over 130 House and Senate members mentioned Gerald Ford as one of their top 3 choices. Nixon also solicited suggestions from his cabinet, staff, and Republican committee members. Republican National Committee members. At the end of the day, on October 11th, after having received suggestions from Gerald Ford and hundreds of others, President Nixon deliberated at Camp David, Maryland. Nixon returned to the White House the next morning, announced to his staff he had made a decision, and at 9:06 p.m. made a live television announcement from the East Room of the White House that Gerald R. Ford was his vice presidential nominee. After having solicited Gerald Ford's recommendations for vice presidential candidates, Nixon chose to ignore Ford's advice and instead choose Gerald Ford himself. Raised in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Ford attended the University of Michigan and Yale Law School. Ford was in the U.S. Naval Reserve during World War II, and in 1949 began his political career as a U.S. representative from Michigan's 5th Congressional District. Ford served as a congressman for 25 years, including 9 as House Minority Leader. He had been re-elected 12 times, each with more than 60% of the vote. Wow. He had served on the Appropriations Committee and the Warren Commission investigating JFK's assassination, and described himself as a moderate in domestic affairs, an internationalist in foreign affairs, and a conservative in fiscal policy. Congressional approval. Section 2 of the 25th Amendment reads, "Whenever there is a vacancy in the office of the vice president, the president shall nominate a vice president who shall take office upon confirmation by a majority vote of both houses of Congress." The amendment does not, however, specify a procedure for confirming a vice presidential candidate. Congress proceeded with Ford's confirmation, knowing a precedent would be set for future confirmations. It was decided that the House Judiciary Committee and the Senate Rules Committee would be responsible for handling the nomination. The confirmation process took 8 weeks as Congress proceeded cautiously due to speculation that the new vice president may become president due to the Watergate scandal. How right they were. Both the House and Senate offered a full FBI background check on Ford. The Senate Rules Committee ordered a detailed audit of Ford's tax returns since 1965 and reviewed a complete report of his voting record throughout his political career. The committee found no bar or impediment which would disqualify Ford. The Senate voted 92-3 for Ford's confirmation. 5 senators were absent from the vote. Okay, that explains 95. And the House approved Ford's nomination by a vote of 387-35. Wow. Gerald Ford was then sworn in before a joint session of Congress an hour after the White House vote in front of the president, his cabinet, the Supreme Court, diplomats, family, and friends. Sorry, beverage pause. In 1974, Nixon resigned due to the Watergate scandal, and Vice President Ford became President Ford. Under the 25th Amendment, Ford then nominated New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller to be his vice president, and Congress again approved. In less than 1 year, both the vice president and the president of the United States had resigned, and until January 1977, men who had not been elected to those positions occupied the United States' top 2 political offices. That is very true and very odd to think about, especially when you read it out loud. Acknowledging this unique situation, Gerald Ford said at his swearing-in ceremony in August 1974, "I am acutely aware that you have not elected me as your president with your ballots, and so I ask you to confirm me as your president with your prayers. I have not campaigned for either the presidency or the vice presidency. I am indebted to no man and only to..." Oh, I like that. "I am indebted to no man and only to one woman, my dear wife, as I begin this very difficult job." After assuming the role as president, Ford served only 895 days, the shortest period of any president who did not die in office. That was fascinating. This is the third of our 4 documents transfer power series. Boom, there you go. Okay. Because as soon as I saw 1973, and then Dear Mr. President, you knew Nixon was going to be involved, and you knew it was going to be something involving Watergate, obviously. And we were right, but there was that extra step there. I forgot momentarily that, yes, Gerald Ford was the only, not only was vice president, but also president, having been elected to neither of those two offices. That's really, really interesting. That is one of the more interesting things in history is chains of commands and all that. I really find it fascinating. But that is the glory of history by mail. Hopefully you enjoyed it because I always do. Thank you so much. Let me know what you think down below. Have a great rest of your weekend, and we will see you tomorrow.